Shonen anime, easily the most recognizable genre of its medium, thrilling millions across the world with strange new lands, lovable characters, and edge-of-your-seat action. But what makes these stories so meaningful to people? Hard work, friendship, and victory. These are the three pillars of Shonen Jump. Together they serve as core virtues of the genre, becoming so ubiquitous that nobody even questions their presence anymore. The message they carry is a simple yet powerful one. If you never give up on your dreams and make friends out of enemies, you'll always succeed in life. That's why these narratives don't just entertain, they inspire people to take action and become stronger in the face of adversity. With such an empowering foundation, it's easy to see how Shonen became a global phenomenon. But what do you do when your perseverance is at odds with a world that hates you? What do you do when your enemies want your extermination, not your friendship? What do you do when these narratives turn out to be just that, fiction, and you have nothing left to believe? Attack on Titan is a story that means a lot to me. It towers above its contemporaries in a very distinct way, daring to question not just the conventions of its genre, but the morality behind it as well. Immediately when it began airing, everyone knew it wasn't your standard shonen fare. That's part of the reason I think it gained traction so quickly. I was in my second year of college when the anime first aired, and I distinctly remember it spreading like wildfire that spring, with people praising it for being so different to everything else at the time. But why though? On paper, it uses a lot of tropes you'd expect from the average shonen story. You've got a loner protagonist, dead parents, teenagers in combat scenarios. There's even a legendary power locked inside the main character, which he then has to master and save the world with. I mean, we all know how that saving the world part turns out. But nobody saw the twist coming back then, and that's my point. The more subversive elements of the story were not immediately obvious, and yet, people instantly knew there was something special about the show. In my opinion, this is because Attack on Titan actually took its characters seriously, presenting a clear vision of what motivated them and making that its focus from the very beginning. If you look back on the first episode, you might be surprised to see there's not a lot of action in it, especially for a shonen. Instead, there's a much bigger emphasis on establishing themes. The little conflict there is only emerges from Eren's temperament, and it's all done to flesh out his character. And from these interactions, we learn a lot about not only him, but the world he lives in. How he doesn't care if everyone thinks he's a fool, he's still gonna pursue freedom, which sets up a philosophical argument for the rest of the series. Even the climax of the episode shows his primary concern, lingering on Eren's despair when his mother's about to die, where lesser stories would just make it as gory as possible. This character-driven approach stands out in an action genre where authors are typically only concerned with plot. It slows down the pacing a little, which carries the risk of people getting bored, but when it works, the audience ends up way more invested in the characters than in the fighting itself, which makes witnessing their growth a more meaningful experience. Think about it for a second. Going on a ninja mission or fighting evil spirits is exciting to watch, I know I love it, but it's not something any of us have actually dealt with. At least I hope not. On the other hand, fighting with parents that want you to conform, having them mislead and use you like a tool for their own ends, hearing them argue about your failures in the other room while you're trying to sleep. You don't need a fox demon to empathize with this, and while there's certainly character development in these other stories, Attack on Titan takes it to another level by making it its main priority. Every arc is just full of grounded moments that bring the characters to life, constantly asking you to see them as people instead of caricatures. This can also be seen in how the women are written. None of them are one-dimensional, naggy, or borderline abusive like in other shonen. Here, they actually have depth. Their personalities all vary from individual to individual. They often play a vital role during conflicts, and there's not really any fan service involving them. The closest we get is Mikasa doing sit-ups, which, while provocative to some, feel like it's because of what it says about her, not because she's there to be leered at. That's why even normies love this story. There's none of the usual anime weirdness like gratuitous panty shots or gravity-defying boobs. More importantly, the themes are so universal, then you can easily share it with folk who don't watch anime, and odds are you're going to enjoy it. I would like to argue, though, that there's a greater message behind using this character-driven style. By prioritizing people who are respectable, Attack on Titan is actually performing its biggest act of subversion and demonstrating a profound respect for life. Now, I know that might sound crazy to some of you, considering how dark the story can get, but please, hear me out. A big criticism one can make of shonen battle manga is how much they trivialize stuff like combat and death. For example, look at Dragon Ball. People die in it all the time, but it rarely leaves an impact because everyone's just brought back to life. Piccolo even goaded Majin Buu into performing a genocide, thinking he could undo it all with a wish. And sure, it worked out in the end, but that logic is still messed up. The few times Death actually had some weight were with Future Gohan or Android 16, you know, characters who couldn't be resurrected. This isn't the case in Attack on Titan, though. People actually die when they are killed. Tragedy often strikes out of nowhere, and it's always uncomfortable when it happens. The characters that do survive are permanently changed by the experience, never fully getting over it. Even when nameless soldiers are eaten, there was never a point where I personally grew numb to it. The scenes always lingered just long enough to disturb me, but it never glorified the brutality either. In fact, combat is always shown as a nasty affair where even the strongest don't come out unscathed. Furthermore, this attitude is also reflected in how we perceive each protagonist. Goku and Eren are a lot more alike than you would initially expect. They're both stubborn and reckless, they're both obsessed with fighting, and, due to their heritage, they both transform into monstrous versions of themselves and kill their dad/father figure because of it. The only reason we don't see Goku as negatively as Eren is due to the fact that these flaws are basically glossed over in Dragon Ball. It's just not that type of story. There's nothing wrong with this, but as a consequence, the narrative kinda tricks you into seeing these shortcomings as lovable quirks, because there's never really any repercussions to them. What makes Attack on Titan so unique is that it's fully aware of this phenomenon and uses it to its advantage. We're so used to siding with the underdog that we don't really question their flaws until it's too late. That's why it's so easy to root for Eren at the beginning, to the point where later on characters themselves comment on this, wondering if they ever really knew him. Unfortunately, some people can't wrap their heads around this idea, thinking that if the story shows its main character doing something horrible, then obviously it's promoting his acts. It can't possibly be trying to get the audience to reflect on themselves. That would be stupid. Ironically enough, this criticism doesn't just apply to the sanctimonious people who call the story fascist. It also applies to the edgelords who defend Eren, calling him a badass despite the fact that he's a monster. And if you feel attacked by any of this, good. That's the point. Your morals are supposed to be challenged by the story. That's what makes it so special to me. It doesn't subvert tropes for shock value. It does it to get you to question their meaning and the role narrative plays in our lives. How easy it is to get swept up in a story because everyone else is doing it, and how things go wrong when they're proven false. Which leads me to... At its core, Attack on Titan is a story about the death of God. Okay, that's a bit of a bold statement, so let me elaborate. I first think it's important to note the setting of the story, which is basically 19th century Germany. In our reality, this is the age when Western civilization began transitioning from a mythological understanding of the world to a more scientific view. One of the first people who noticed this change was a 19th century German philosopher called Friedrich Nietzsche. He actually lived through the time period of Attack on Titan, which makes his observations very relevant to its message. Many people know him because of his famous quote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." But what did he mean by this? When most people hear the word God, they think of a judgmental figure like Yahweh, an omnipotent skyfather that sees and knows all. But in that statement, Nietzsche wasn't talking about the death of a sentient being like you and me. He was actually referring to a worrying trend that loomed on the horizon for Europe, a great disillusionment in any ideals beyond the material and hedonistic. He even had a word for it called nihilism. This is why I think it's important to see God as less like a person and more like an abstract concept, something akin to truth in Full Metal Alchemist, which is also an anime set in a vaguely German country in a similar time period. They even share the same message, but for our discussion, we'll be focusing on their general skepticism of narrative. More specifically, the danger of cynical ideologies that arise when the truth isn't valued anymore. You see, since the dawn of time, humans have used storytelling as a way to codify what they learn and pass it on to future generations so they don't repeat the same mistakes. As these narratives accumulate, you end up with a mythology full of triumphs and warnings from which cultures define their morality. This is because, like I alluded to in the beginning of this video, these stories weren't told just for entertainment's sake. Their lessons were implicitly telling people how to live and distinguish right from wrong. Eventually, after centuries of refinement, the values they upheld solidified into a system of belief from which religion emerged. In essence, God was the ultimate story we invented, a myth people told each other to navigate the world and find meaning in their existence. It wasn't perfect, obviously, but the idea of God was vital to the development of many fields, like art and science. Also, having this one thing in common enabled a lot more diplomacy between cultures that would have otherwise destroyed each other. Seriously, think of how much the Europeans have waged war among themselves, and then imagine how much worse it could have been if they all followed a different religion. In many ways, the idea of God provided structure to society, sheltering it from the tyranny of chaos, almost like a giant wall. See where I'm going with this? Just like in our reality, the people of Paradis depended on narratives to make sense of their lives. They told themselves they would be safe from Titans as long as they stayed inside the walls, making it the basis of their entire religion. Anyone who disagreed was treated with contempt because it attacked their most important value. This is Jones right from the start, and it's not very subtle either. Armin's introduction is him saying that humanity should one day go outside the walls, but he gets punched in the face and called a heretic for it. This immediately tells us something important about the setting. Questioning anything about the walls is the same as questioning God. The monarchy also discouraged any discussion about this, using religion as a tool to control the population and quash critical thinking. The story even goes out of its way to show that Armin and Eren are in the minority here. Most people, including Mikasa, were okay with following the narrative because it made them feel safe. With all this in mind, it's easy to see the walls, and therefore God, as less like a useful idea and more like a fence for domesticated cattle. And then, well, we know what happens later that day. The metaphor writes itself. From their perspective, the physical manifestation of God's will is crumbling right before their eyes. Society is forever changed, and denying it will only make things worse. That didn't stop people from deluding themselves, though. Many still kept believing in the narrative long after Wall Maria fell, thinking that if they join the military police and stay inside the inner district, they'll be comfortable for the rest of their lives. And that isn't true at all. In fact, nobody's safe. That realization is what drove Eren in the beginning. He lacked any talent, but outworked most of his peers because he actually understood the gravity of their situation. This tension between people who create their own values versus those who let society decide for them sets the stage for the rest of the series, showing how humans cope when the narratives that hold our world together are proven false. Some grow stronger, creating a better story for themselves, while others just spiral into nihilism. Look at Reiner. He became a warrior because his mother always told him it would get him a father. Gabi turned into a zealot because she needed to believe she was different from the devils of Paradis. In both cases, these stories motivated them to be exceptional, and when taken away, it destroyed their sense of self. The best example of this, however, is Eren's entire journey. Every narrative that was fed to him from birth turned out to be wrong. First, the walls didn't keep anyone safe. In fact, a chunk of it is what doomed his mother. Then, a close friend whom he saw as an older brother was directly responsible for this tragedy. Furthermore, his father was supposed to be a respected doctor, someone who swore an oath to save lives, but he ended up being a resentful murderer from a distant land. As if that wasn't enough, the royal family had been manipulating everyone's memories all along, so their notion of history was completely wrong. And finally, Eren discovers that Titans weren't really monsters, just cursed people, which meant that the anger that drove him needed a different target, or he wouldn't have a reason to live anymore. Oh, did I mention that not only are there humans beyond the walls, but they all want Eldians dead? Because there was also that too. After going through all this, it would be incredibly difficult to believe in anything. And if truth isn't real, and nothing actually matters, it's simple to conclude that the only thing that really does exist is power. On the surface, it's really easy to think that nihilism is the main message of Attack on Titan. or Nietzsche for that matter. This couldn't be farther from the truth though. Eren isn't meant to be a role model. He's a grim reminder of what happens when the future looks so bleak that people give up on life. If you see everything as a ruthless power struggle without any meaning, there's no point in creating anything that will outlast you because, well, nothing matters. The only purpose of strength is destruction. And that's the biggest problem with Eren's mindset. Nihilism simply isn't a sustainable belief, if you can even call it that. It may sound confusing to some, but even when someone says they don't believe in anything, that's still a guiding principle, just not a very constructive one. Mix this with the fact that most people don't like being wrong, and you end up with a bunch of folk who insist on the meaninglessness of life with an almost religious fervor. Ironic, isn't it? At the end of the day, it's like Kenny Ackerman said. Everybody's drunk on something. Some people are honest and responsible with their alcohol, while others can't even admit they have a drinking problem. This doesn't mean we have to bring back prohibition, though. Values are something that humans create whether we want to or not, so if it's gonna happen anyway, we might as well have the best ones possible. Attack on Titan isn't interested in preaching to you, though. That would defeat the point of questioning narrative and creating your own values. Instead, it encourages you to analyze your own morals by showing where people tend to go wrong with them. This idea is largely explored with 2 points of view, which Nietzsche called master morality and slave morality. Master morality is a kingly or knightly code of ethics. It's concerned with ideals like honor, courage, and strength. A typical hero under this framework would be a warrior, praised for their dominance and leadership on the battlefield. Mythological figures like Achilles or Gilgamesh come to mind here. Despite their legendary feats, they're not exactly what we would call good people. In fact, they're often selfish and spiteful to their own detriment. Aren't you of anyone? Eren shows an affinity for these values all throughout the story, with his bravery and aggression framed like a virtue at first. This is summed up in one of his iconic lines, "Only those who attack can win." It's literally in the name of the show, and to a certain extent, it's true. Somebody has to go beyond the walls. The alternative is sitting around until humanity goes extinct. For instance, everyone panicked after the Colossal Titan appeared again in Trost, except for Eren. Some gave up as soon as they heard the news. Then Eren spoke up, and the cats actually developed some backbone. He didn't even have to be present to influence people. Jon only summoned the strength to act after he remembered Eren's courage, leading his comrades to survival. Also, this is Mikasa's whole deal, not just during her tragic backstory, where Eren saves her and literally urges her to fight, but also during her near-death experience, while she's processing Eren's supposed death. We see her give up for a moment, then keep fighting due to her memories of him. I do want to highlight, though, that there's a big difference between the values being shown at the start and the destructive ideology that the Jaegerists eventually embody, but I'll get to that soon enough. For now, what's important to note is that what people regarded as good was a little different from how we see it now. It used to be a lot more about utility than moral righteousness. Being strong and wealthy was considered good because these things are helpful. On the other hand, being weak and poor was considered bad because these things hindered you. Notice I'm not using the word evil, though. That wasn't really a thing under this framework. If you were powerful enough to get away with something, it was often seen as an admirable trait because you earned it. That's why a hero like Odysseus can end his story by slaughtering a courtyard full of people and be cheered for it. This, however, exposes the biggest flaw in this value system, in that it turns a blind eye to the cruelty it encourages, often at the expense of the weak or less fortunate. You see, while master values definitely have some merit behind them, this type of logic only really works among people who are equally powerful. Two warriors battling over something important can be meaningful and inspiring, but there's nothing impressive about hurting someone weaker than you, and, all too often, this is how the powerful establish dominance. Another way of thinking about it is high school mentality, where the world is neatly separated into chads, who deserve special treatment due to their alleged superiority, and virgins, who need to know their place and tolerate the bullying. This might sound fair on the surface, if you're a teenager, but it quickly falls apart under scrutiny. Like, sure, a great king might embody these ideals and be worthy of everything he's earned, but it doesn't mean you should build an entire political system around exceptional individuals. They're rare by definition. Even if they do a good job, there's no guarantee the heirs will be any good. In fact, Statistically speaking, they're more likely to be worse because they lack the experience of someone who actually worked for the position, so why should they be in charge? You usually never hear a good answer to this. People who offended always benefit from the status quo and are looking to protect their own interests. Worse than that, this type of thinking slightly implies that those who find themselves at the bottom of society are there because they deserve it. If you didn't want to be a slave, you shouldn't have let yourself be conquered, nerd. Eren actually demonstrates this attitude near the start of the story. After evacuating his home, he saw receiving food as pathetic and would rather starve to death than feel like a parasite. Mikasa quickly knocked some sense into him, but this mentality didn't just go away. During the training corps arc, when candidates started dropping out, Eren had an elitist opinion about their departure, saying that those who were powerless just didn't belong there. That is, until it looked like he would be sent home too. Then he changed his tune real quick, begging for help even when, by his own standards, he wasn't worthy of it. And that's really the problem in a nutshell. Master morality is ultimately hypocritical and self-serving. It ignores the fact that no matter how exceptional a person is, we all need each other's help to keep the world running, and a lot of folk just never get a fair shot at participating to begin with. It never mattered if a slave demonstrated all the qualities a master considered virtuous. At the end of the day, they would always be considered property. Needless to say, this isn't really a sustainable framework. Eventually, people are gonna revolt. Sometimes this will result in a violent uprising, but that's not what I'm talking about here, because that type of revolution usually romanticizes aggressive values, ending with yet another ruling class that eventually oppresses people in much the same way. What I'm talking about here is a slave revolt of the mind. You see, while the masters could certainly control the physical conditions of the slaves, they couldn't really force any of them to be happy about it. Or, in other words, they could tell them what to do, but never what to believe. And thus, herd morality is born. In response to unfair treatment, people develop ideals that are opposite to what their oppressors value. Traits like humility, weakness, and mercy then become the highest virtues a person could strive towards, and the previous values, like power or wealth, are seen as evil. One example of this are the 7 deadly sins, which in Christianity are seen as the worst traits a person could have, but under master morality, they could be seen as qualities typical of great people. The results of this moral slave revolt can still be felt today. Even after Western society became more secular, concepts like charity and equality are still foundational to our modern sense of good. Also, attitudes like lusting for power and seeking revenge are still generally frowned upon to this day. This doesn't just apply to the West, though. Japanese culture went through a similar change after World War II. People had witnessed the consequences of imperialism and wanted nothing to do with it, valuing pacifism instead. This could be seen in their shonen manga, which, after the war, couldn't depict combat or even sports competitions due to strict guidelines. Remnants of this attitude can still be seen in more recent stories, like Goku's tendency to spare his enemies or Naruto's famous Talk no Jutsu. As nice as it sounds, however, this type of thinking is not without its flaws either, and can be even more insidious and destructive than its predecessor. Remember, this was a slave revolt of the spirit. Their avenues of attack were psychological, not physical, because using violence would defeat its purpose. The point was to be as different as possible from the masters, which is difficult if you're killing them, so in order to claim the moral high ground, herd mentality uses passive-aggressive guilt-tripping instead. It might sound like a joke, but if you've ever seen a self-loathing Catholic, you know what I mean. And if you haven't, well, imagine there's a master punishing a slave, but instead of crying out in pain, the slave just says, "Harder, I deserve it." You'd be weirded out too, right? At the very least, it'll make you stop for a moment and question what you're doing. That's basically how Christianity took over the Roman Empire, and it's also where things start to go wrong with it. Like I mentioned earlier, master morality defines good as that which is helpful to you. Since slave morality only exists to be the opposite of this, it makes the mistake of demonizing values that are helpful and elevating ones that are harmful. More specifically, suffering is seen as a good thing because it's a measure of how unwilling you are to hurt others. This is why the defining symbol of Christianity is a man being tortured to death, and it's woven into the belief system at every level. A good Christian doesn't fight back when confronted with violence. Instead, they have to turn the other cheek. When someone exploits them, they're not supposed to seek justice. They're supposed to swallow their pride and forgive the transgression because God will take care of it in the afterlife. At every point here, instead of being cruel to another person, they choose to be cruel to themselves because they think it's the right thing to do. The epitome of this is the concept of martyrdom, which demands that you ignore your own self-preservation instincts in service of others. Christians don't like to admit it, but nobody wants to be a martyr. Not even Jesus. Seriously, it's in the Bible and it makes complete sense. The most powerful feeling a person can have is the will to live, and under this value system, repressing it is the definition of goodness. Sure, there may be situations where it's the only option, but that doesn't make it an inherently good thing. It'd be better if you were strong enough to prevent its need in the first place. Look at Carla Jaeger, Aaron's mother. When she's pinned under the rubble, her main priority is making sure the kids are safe, and she's willing to die for it. However, as soon as they are out of earshot, she can't lie to herself anymore, quietly wishing they would turn around and save her. This wasn't just shown to tug at your heartstrings, it was done to send a message. Hurt morality doesn't empower anyone into action or protect them from harm. It just helps people cope with their weakness by surrendering their own autonomy. And that's, well, bad. As uncomfortable as it may sound, cruelty is a necessary part of the human condition. You engage in it every time you assert power over someone. It can be as innocuous as winning a competitive game, or important like enforcing a personal boundary. The point is, you can't simply ask people to never be cruel. It's the same as martyrdom. You're asking them to stop being human. Since this is impossible, people are forced to bottle up this anger and turn it inwards, which inevitably leads to self-hatred being considered a moral good. And if God is dead, it isn't hard to conclude that merely being born is a mistake. In Attack on Titan, this is demonstrated through different members of the Eldian royal family. Karl Fritz, the first king in the Walls, held the opinion that Eldians and Titans should have never existed in the first place. In order to feel like a good person, he decided to punish himself in the most selfish way possible, destroying his own empire while dooming the people who lived in it. Frida Reiss later inherited his vow to renounce war, and arrived at the same conclusion. She preached peace and love, but while arguing with Grisha Jaeger, she had no trouble letting her people die for the sake of supposed atonement. This is what I mean by cruelty turned inwards. The decision to protect the world from Eldians by sacrificing them without their knowledge is just as cruel, if not more, than simply going to war. Innocents are gonna suffer either way, and Frida does nothing, all while getting to enjoy the luxurious life of a noble and getting to feel self-righteous about it. This is then taken to its logical extreme in the form of Sieg Jaeger. Unlike his relatives, who at least believed in goodness and the sanctity of life, Sieg is a full-blown nihilist and has no qualms sacrificing others to further his goals. He literally says nobody would have to suffer if they weren't born, and he sees sterilizing the Eldians as both a mercy and a public service. It's tragic, really. Sieg grew up hearing that a person like him shouldn't exist, and his parents worked hard to oppose this, but their approach was so flawed that it had the opposite effect on him. Eren called him out on this to his face, saying he's a pathetic man whose continued denial of his father's wishes is his only means of self-affirmation. And it's true. Sieg needed to believe his parents were completely wrong about everything in order to feel like betraying them was the right choice. Unfortunately, it also came at the cost of having to accept that Eldians were a threat to the world. This is a microcosm of how hurt morality tends to work out after the death of God. It looks harmless on the surface, maybe even rational and kind-hearted, but it's ultimately an anti-life philosophy, saying people are inherently evil due to their cruelty, and in order to be good, one has to avoid being human as much as possible. So, obviously, the story is saying that the world would be a better place if everyone was a Sigma male like Eren, but he's just too base for the normies, right?
Incorrect.
Master morality looks good here by comparison because, despite its flaws, at least it affirms the value of life, even if it's only your own. Whereas slave morality is only created out of spite for someone else. It doesn't care about inspiring good in people, only in punishing evil. But, like I mentioned a while ago, Eren is a nihilist that's only concerned with destruction. He doesn't see the point in creating anything either, which, despite valuing aggression and freedom, warps his mentality into something closer to herd morality rather than master morality. And the key to understanding this similarity lies in resentment. Although they look like opposites, both the Eldian royal family and the Jaegerist movement share the same origin, in that they're both born from resentment. And resentment, well, it's in the word. It's the echo of a feeling, or resentiment. These are negative emotions that can't be acted upon due to a lack of power, so when people are forced to hold on to them, it causes a feedback loop where they're stuck feeling the same emotion over and over long after it had occurred. With enough time, these feelings can possess people and take over their lives without them even realizing it. In the story, this is reinforced by the fact that the royal family's herd morality can be directly traced back to a little slave girl who felt bad for the cattle and decided to free them. Ymir is portrayed as the biggest victim of the world's cruelty, all because of her kindness. She lived to make other people happy, everyone but herself, to the point where she had to deny her own humanity in order to cope with it, and allowed her resentment to brew for millennia until she just wanted everything destroyed. Eren actually understood this, and that's how he managed to persuade her. You are not a slave, and you are not a god either. You're only human. You don't have to obey anyone. Just decide for yourself. Titans are the literal embodiment of how much she hates the world. This means the royal family's religion is literally built on resentment, because the walls, their object of worship, are made of Titans. Mikasa also alluded to this idea when she first saw Eren in his Titan form. She called him the physical manifestation of humanity's anger, and she was way more correct than she realized. If we analyze Eren's stated goal, slaughter all the Titans, we can clearly see that it too is built on resentment. His objective isn't protecting the people he loves, or exploring the unknown, or reaching truth, or liberating humanity. It's all about revenge for him. This becomes most apparent during the final season after he completes his transition into villainy, but it didn't come out of nowhere. The first incident we can notice this is before Eren gets eaten, all the way back in the Battle of Trost. Everything seemed to be on track until one of his fellow cadets, Thomas, got swallowed whole right in front of the squad. Although horrifying, they weren't immediately screwed. They were still capable of completing their objective until, well, Eren pulled an Eren. He instantly gave into his rage and broke formation to avenge his comrade, which caused everyone in his squad to scramble after him and left them an easy target for the Titans. All those deaths were his fault, but while he's being digested, Eren just blames the Titans even more. This is a similar coping strategy to the one Zeke developed over his parents. Eren needed to scapegoat the Titans because the alternative was admitting he got his squad killed. It sounds basic, to the point where most people just gloss over this incident, but I think it's important that, even early on, Eren's resentment is shown to have devastating consequences, and he seems incapable of recognizing this. One can also see this when he saved Mikasa as a child. Although his actions were heroic, the reasoning he gave afterwards was couched in resentment. He called the kidnappers beasts in human clothing that served to be slaughtered, which is unnerving to hear from anyone that recently committed a murder, let alone a child. He also shows a blatant disregard for his own life, which his father rightfully scolds him for. Mikasa's breakthrough during that whole ordeal is also tainted in a similar way. While she's having a revelation about the world, that you're either predator or prey, the musical cue in that scene even takes on a malevolent tone. That might not mean much on its own, but if you compare it to any other triumphant moment in the story, this epiphany is clearly being shown in a negative light. It's the death of Mikasa's innocence. At best, it's a tragic necessity, and at worst, it's a dramatic event that literally reconfigured her brain and optimized it for violence. And then there's the case of Grisha Jaeger. I don't think anyone could fault him for his initial motives. The way his sister died would scar anyone for life. His resentment, though, led him down a path he would eventually regret. Much like his two kids, Grisha also compensated for his trauma by devoting himself wholeheartedly to a dream. Zeke even points it out while begging his parents to quit the resistance movement, mentioning that Grisha's sister wouldn't have died if he hadn't taken her beyond the wall. This morphed into an obsession fueled by vengeance, where he convinced himself the cause was so noble it needed to be accomplished by any means necessary. That's why he treated Zeke like a tool instead of an individual. Eldian restoration was more important to him than his son, not because it was the right thing to do, but because he cared more about validating his resentment than about raising his child. Even after he started a new life and had seemingly moved on, he fully commits to killing the Rice family when Eren goads him with the memory of his sister and everyone else he lost, proving that, in the end, he was still ruled by anger. There's a core theme being reinforced here. No matter the context, resentment is always shown to be a toxic source of motivation that should never be embraced. It blinds people to the things that matter most and instantly corrupts any righteous intentions, regardless of how justified they may sound on the surface. And this, in my opinion, is the meaning behind Titans. Every person that received the Attack Titan was inheriting an enormous amount of past and future resentment. Even the basic conceit of them is an exaggerated metaphor of how people lose their humanity when used as weapons. These creatures don't eat because they're hungry, they just do it out of instinct, for its own sake. You can't reason with them because they have no innate drives like procreation or self-preservation. Their only goal is destruction. You know, kinda like Eren. The Eldians on Paradis have no problem rallying behind him because he expresses this bottled up fury on their behalf. Again, like I keep repeating, these feelings are always repressed due to a lack of strength, so when they do come out, it empowers those who used to be burdened by them, and asking them to be weak again would only provoke them more. That's why a disturbing amount of people don't care that Eren's committing genocide, not when they've been terrorized by Titans and demonized by the outside world for over a century. In the end, it turns out Commander Pixis was right all along. If humanity were to go extinct, it wouldn't be because of the Titans. It would be because humanity turned on itself. I keep saying that Attack on Titan isn't nihilistic, but so far, I've only mentioned where people go wrong with morality, and not any solutions, which brings up the most important question the story raises. If God is dead, if morality is fake, if we're all destined to be cruel one way or the other, should we just embrace nihilism and give up on being good people? No! Of course not! Genocide is wrong. No reasoning in the world can make it right. And that's the most beautiful thing about Attack on Titan. It doesn't tell you what to believe, but it does show you a path and encourages you to explore it for yourself. All you have to do is keep moving forward. Time and time again, the characters find themselves in situations where there's seemingly no good options. And yet, no matter how grim the odds are, we're shown that giving up only makes things worse. The first notable example of this comes in the Battle of Trost. When the supply squad refused to do their job, that decision doomed every other soldier that counted on them. The cadets realized this when they start running out of gas, and looking at the big picture, it was reasonable to get overwhelmed and assume the situation was hopeless. But what did they do? They solved the problem one step at a time. Oh, the supply squad won't come to us? We'll go to them. Oh, the fortress is surrounded? Throw Eren at it. What's that? The supply room is infested with Titans and there's little room to maneuver? Act as bait and shoot out their eyes while the others land a killing blow. It would have been impossible if they planned for everything at once, but tackling each challenge as it arose allowed them to overcome everything. All throughout the story, there's tons of little moments where this idea is reasserted. At the end of the second season, when they're surrounded and all seems lost, Eren punches a Titan out of a stubborn refusal to surrender. It should have been ineffective, but that one seemingly futile act unlocked his founding Titan powers, which wound up saving them. Then, in the third season, we have what is largely the most positive conclusion to an arc in the entire story. Hanji explained it best. Nobody was able to overthrow the government on their own. Everyone's choices, regardless of how insignificant they appeared, are what ended up changing their world. On a more individual note, Historia's character arc is centered entirely around this theme of opposing fate. Initially, she suffered from the same anti-life philosophy that's common in her family. Just like Zeke, she grew up believing she was better off never being born, and developed a martyr complex to feel like her existence had worth. Her actual personality was covered up by a mask of niceness, where she only acted kind, not because she felt it, but because she desperately wanted to be accepted. Ymir, the lesbian, not the ancestor, was the first person to see through this act. She too went through a similar experience of living for the sake of others and suffering for it, so when she sees someone else going down the same path, she feels compelled to stop them. Her purpose in life is to prove that your fate is decided at birth, and if Historia had the strength to be that cruel towards herself, where she would freeze to death if it meant people would think fondly of her, then that meant she also had the strength to change her destiny. This becomes even more meaningful by the fact that the royal family is on more than one occasion regarded as divine instruments of fate. It first happens in Historia's introduction, where Sasha thinks she's a god for bringing her food and water. Then, Historia's father sees God in the eyes of his brother after he inherited Founding Titan. Finally, there's Elena, who worships Zeke with a zealous devotion, calling him a god that gave hope to the powerless. In all these instances, God is equated with an ultimate governing force, one that decides the fate of people in the world, and the royal family are the ones carrying out its will. Historia, on the other hand, rejects this notion completely. She doesn't want a world where one person gets to decide who should and shouldn't exist. That's why, when her father is pushing her to accept godhood, she refuses to go through with it, choosing to finally live on her own terms and construct her own values, even if it makes her the worst, most despicable girl in history. This resulted in changing not only her fate, but the fate of everyone in Paradise. What a queen. Literally. My favorite moment where this theme is highlighted, though, doesn't involve anything as climactic as denying godhood. It's a lot more personal and meta than that. You see, Sasha Brow's favorite potato girl turned out to be an even bigger symbol of changing destiny than Historia. In the second season, when Sasha has to warn her village of Titans, she starts having flashbacks to before she became soldier. We see she wasn't a particularly moral person back then, thinking selfishly and resenting all the refugees who came after the walls fell. Then, in the present, she finds Kaya, who is paralyzed with fear while her mother is being eaten. Sasha tries to save the girl before the Titan can notice, but things start to quickly go wrong. She loses her axe, the horse leaves them behind, and the Titan is quickly gaining on her. To make matters worse, Kaya's world had fallen apart after seeing the village abandon her mother, which makes her question the whole point of altruism while they're being pursued. Sasha gives her an answer, not with words, but through action. Where before she was reluctant to help anyone else, now she's risking her life to save someone she doesn't even know. After sending Kaya ahead, Sasha fires a few arrows and misses, but lands a third one in the Titan's eye. With one arrow remaining, Sasha needs to land this, or both she and Kaya will die. So what does she do? She takes her fate into her own hand, rushing forwards toward the Titan and stabbing it herself. Fuck. I genuinely can't talk about this without getting emotional. This is what it's all about to me. What elevates this sequence, though, is something I learned afterwards about how this moment was conceived. In a later interview, Isayama Hajime revealed that he actually considered killing Sasha off in this chapter, but obviously decided against it. So yeah, Sasha didn't just fight her fate inside the story, she literally transcended her own reality to achieve it. You may not like it, that puts her on the same power level of Aizen. Okay, so we've seen examples of how never giving up is what allows people to develop their morality. However, if you think about where the story goes in the later half, there's a glaring problem with this. After all, it's easy to think that Eren's refusal to give up is what enabled the rumbling. That, however, ignores something very crucial about his arc. You see, Eren didn't fight his fate at the end. Quite the opposite. He embraced it, and by doing so, ended up enslaving himself. Eren isn't free. He thinks he is, but that's not really the case. This is vital to understanding his character, and it's explicitly shown in the turning point of the story, before Eren initiates his attack on Libero. During his conversation with Reiner, he mentions the reason he's there is because he has no other choice. He then absolves Reiner and the other warriors from their actions, claiming they were only kids who also didn't have a choice. To cap it all off, Eren ends the conversation by saying they were both born that way, almost like it was their fate to do what they did. The implication here is pretty clear. Eren doesn't think anyone is responsible for their actions because everything has already been decided for them. That's the opposite of freedom, a betrayal of everything he used to believe. Some people like to defend his actions, claiming there was no other way to protect his home. The whole point of fighting your fate is that you do it regardless of how futile it looks. Eren never tried to find another way. He didn't even tell anyone what he was going through. He just gave up when he realized he was going to die in a few years. Again, people like to use the Curse of Ymir as an excuse, and while more understandable, having a shortened lifespan doesn't justify anything he does. This is supposed to be a tragedy. His actions are meant to sadden and disappoint us. But that's a far cry from saying he had no other options. And that's precisely what the story is trying to communicate. If you don't believe in something beyond power, you'll blind yourself to any solutions that don't involve hurting others. Unfortunately, this still doesn't answer anything. For example, one could argue that Floch found meaning in Eldian nationalism, what made him courageous and allowed him to endure a lot of punishment, but that doesn't make him a moral person. In fact, he was an asshole who kept ruining everything. Just because he grew his spine at the end doesn't mean he's cool. He gleefully sacrificed people for the sake of his ideal, and this is exactly where characters tend to go wrong in the story. In every occasion that someone valued a narrative over human life, they're always framed as the villain for it. This is because when your values are more important than people, you can justify any actions in order to uphold them, no matter how horrifying. It doesn't just apply to how we treat others either. When you value an ideal above your own life, you end up being a slave to it, even if you think you're choosing it. That's the difference between Historia's martyr complex and a noble sacrifice like with Erwin or Hanji. One was done out of low self-worth, while the other was done out of love and respect for their comrades. This is one of the more subtle messages of the story. Eren isn't a victim of fate. He did all of this to himself. From his perspective, manipulating Grisha and setting all of the events into motion is proof of his own autonomy, which is a fundamental misunderstanding of freedom. You see, freedom isn't doing as you please without any consequences. That's the attitude of a child. Humans are free because we can choose to overcome our desires, accepting moral responsibility for our actions. This doesn't mean we should ignore our feelings, but if we always followed our violent impulses, they would always decide our fate, and we'd be no different from wild animals. And yes, I understand humans are animals too. What I'm saying is that we're not just animals. We're also more than that. A tiger can't choose to be anything other than a predator, because it always has to follow its instincts. But humans don't have to be this way. This finally leads us to the answer Attack on Titan gives for the question of nihilism. It asks you, well, pleads you really, to believe in your own worth and value humanity just as much. That people aren't a means to an end, they are the end itself, including you. It might feel pointless at times, especially when the cycle of hatred doesn't seem to end, but that's all the more reason to keep trying. Remember how Sasha managed to change her fate? Some might argue it was pointless because she ended up dying anyway a few years later. But if she hadn't survived, she wouldn't have tasted seafood. You can roll your eyes all you want, it's the truth. Look how happy she is. I would die to protect this beautiful mess of a person. How could life not be worth living, even if only a little while longer, when you can experience so much joy from even the smallest moments? That's why, even while Eren is carrying out the rumbling, all he's thinking about are his friends, because that's what ultimately matters. It's also why Levi and Hanji are the most moral individuals in the story. Their main concern is always protecting human life, and they create their values in service of that, not the other way around, where others seem to only care about people because their beliefs tell them to. And this brings us back to what I said at the beginning about character-driven storytelling. Why this focus on people over action was so important to communicating its message, and how that makes the story so different to most shonen out there. Attack on Titan isn't saying that narratives are worthless, or that believing in stuff is cringe. It's saying the most valuable narratives are about elevating people, not ideals, and that giving up on the world will just make things worse. The most obvious evidence I have to support this is the name of the very first episode, To You, 2,000 years from now. In a way, this title frames Attack on Titan as a story within a story, where the idea is that someone is witnessing these events in the far future, almost like a warning in the shape of a myth. Whether or not it works is up to the audience, because this anonymous viewer is also a stand-in for us. After witnessing everything these characters go through, you're the one who gets to decide if it's meaningful, or just an entertaining distraction. That's why I started this essay by saying that Attack on Titan means a lot to me. Let's just say all the narratives I was raised with turned out to be wrong, and it took me a while to get over that disillusionment. I also know I'm not alone. This anime wouldn't have been so popular if it didn't connect with the audience. A lot of people nowadays find it hard to believe in anything, whether in themselves or in others, causing them to grow isolated and hate humanity. Doomers aren't just a funny meme. It's self-hatred being normalized and projected outwards, which is what makes the story so important. To remember that, no matter how monstrous they look, our enemies are just as human as us. That memories of those we love are what drive us to lead moral lives, and that our virtues are wings of freedom, something we invented to soar above the brutality of nature and reach towards an unseen horizon. So offer your heart to life, and reject nihilism, because you only lose when you stop attacking. Before I go, I'd like to share that I have a free ebook available on a pinned comment below. It's called Shotgun Fantasy, and it's basically a less cynical version of Breaking Bad, except instead of cooking meth, they're building magic guns. Like I said, it's free, and you can find it on a pinned comment below. You know, I've been working on this video for 6 months now, and now that I'm about to end it, I'm terrified freeing it into the world. Mostly because I don't think anyone will really watch it, but if you're one of the few people who actually makes it to the end, thank you. I hope it was worth your time. So, until next time, peace.